Welcome to Short Story Theatre. Today, Asa Bittridge tells the tale of a man who reaches his 50th birthday and finally decides to confront his worst childhood fears. Now, knee-deep into middle age, those old fears should have no grip on him. But since this is Bill Russo's short story theatre, you know things are not going to go well. Here's Asa Bittridge with The Midnight Express.
It was a battered old book, bound in faded leather. He found it when he was 12 years old, on an upper shelf in the living room of his parents' house. And against all the rules, he took it into his bedroom to read under the covers, using his flashlight when the rest of the house was sound asleep. That's when young Jonathan read the book. His room was like an isolated little cell where he could read the forbidden volume while everyone else in the house had surrendered to the end of the day and had fallen asleep. By contrast with those unconscious ones, his elders, it made Jonathan feel intensely alive in every nerve and fiber of his young brain. The ticking of the old-fashioned grandfather clock in the hall below echoed the beating of his own heart. The long-drawn rhythmical sliding of the waves of the ocean on the distant coast filled him with a sense of overwhelming mystery. And as he read, the soft pattern of the family dog walking up the stairs made him start and listen, like a creature of the woods at the sound of a cracking twig. The leather-bound book had the strangest fascination for him, but he never quite understood the thread of the story. It was called The Midnight Express. And there was one picture on the 50th page upon which he could never dare to gaze. It frightened him. Young Johnny never understood the effect of that picture on him. He was an imaginative but not a neurotic youngster. And he avoided that 50th page just as he would an axe murderer climbing up the stairs. But there never really seemed to be nothing in the picture to account for his haunting dread of it. Indeed, solitude was almost its chief characteristic. It showed an empty railroad station platform at night lit by a dreary single street light. It was an empty railway platform that suggested a deserted and lonely junction in some remote part of New Hampshire in northern New England. There was only one figure on the platform, the dark figure of a man standing almost directly under the streetlight with his face turned away toward the black mouth of a tunnel. A railroad tunnel which for some strange reason plunged the imagination of young Jonathan into a pit of horror. The solitary man seemed to be listening. His attitude was tense, expectant, as though he were awaiting some fearful tragedy. There was nothing in the text, so far as Johnny could read and could understand, to account for this frightening nightmare. He could neither resist the fascination of the book, nor face that picture in the stillness and loneliness of the night. He sectioned off the page, quarantining it with 2 large paper clips so that he would not happen upon it by accident. Then he decided to read the whole story all the way through. But all this was before he came to page 50, when he fell asleep, and the outlines of what he had read were blurred. And the next night he had to begin at the very beginning, again and again and again, as always. Before he came to the 50th page, he fell asleep. The years went by and Johnny grew up and forgot all about the book and the picture, but halfway through his life, at that strange and critical time when he entered upon his 50th year, one night he found himself a little before midnight waiting for a train at a lonely station near Bell's Neck, some 40 miles west of Concord, the capital of New Hampshire. In the distance, the clock in the steeple of a village church began to strike 12. Jonathan remembered like a man waking up from a long dream. There under the single, solitary streetlight on the long, almost deserted railroad platform, there in front of him was the dark and solitary figure that he knew from his boyhood. The face was turned away from him, looking towards the dark mouth of the railroad tunnel. Everything was just as it had been some 40 years ago. But he was not frightened, not as he had been in childhood, as a grown man being gripped by the serenity of middle age. He would go up to that solitary figure, confront it, and see the face that so long had been hidden from him. He would walk quietly up to it and make some excuse for talking to it. He would ask it, for instance, if the train was going to be late. It should be easy for a grown man to do this. But his hands were clenched when he took the first step. He tried twice to march forward, but didn't budge until the third try. With vague and odd instincts awakening, he went toward the solitary figure on the platform. But when he walked under the street light and swung around abruptly to speak to it and saw, without speaking, without being able to speak, it was himself staring back at him, as in some mocking mirror, his own eyes alive in his own pale face, looking into his own eyes, alive. The nerves of his heart tingled as though their own electric current would paralyze it. A wave of panic went through him. He turned, he stumbled, he broke into a blind run out through the deserted and echoing ticket office onto the long moonlit road behind the station. The whole New Hampshire countryside seemed to be utterly deserted. The moonbeams flooded it with the loneliness of their own deserted existence. He paused for a moment and heard, like the echo of his own footsteps, the stumbling run of something that followed him. It was following him over the wooden floor in the ticket office. Then he abandoned himself shamelessly to his fear and ran sweating like a terrified beast down the long road between two endless lines of ghostly trees, each answering another into what seemed like an infinite distance on each side of the road. There was a long, straight canal in which one of the lines of trees was endlessly reflected. Again, he heard the footsteps behind him. They seemed to be slowly but steadily gaining upon him a quarter of a mile away. Johnny saw a small white cottage by the roadside. A white cottage with 2 dark windows in the door that somehow suggested a human face. He thought to himself, if he could reach it in time, he would find shelter and escape. The doppelganger footsteps echoing his own were still some way off. He lurched, gasping, into the little porch. He grabbed the knob of the door and found it locked against him. He pounded on the wood with his fists, pounded until his knuckles were bleeding. The response was horribly slow. At last, he heard heavy footsteps from inside the cottage. Slowly, they descended a creaking stairway. Slowly. Then the door was unlocked. A tall, shadowy figure stood before him, holding a flashlight in such a way that he could see little either of the holder's face or form, but to his horror, there seemed to be a dirty, wrinkled cloth wrapped around the face. No words passed between them. The figure beckoned him in. As he obeyed it, the figure locked the door behind him, then beckoned him again without a word. The figure walked up the crooked stairway with no other light except that of a flashlight, casting huge and grotesque shadows on the whitewashed walls and ceiling. They entered an upper room in which there was a brightly lit fire in a huge fireplace with an armchair on either side of it and a small oak table. And on that small oak table was a battered old book bound in dried-out, faded leather. The silent figure with the dirty, wrinkled cloth covering his face pointed to one of the armchairs and put the flashlight on the table by the book. There was no other light but that of the fire. The silent masked figure left the room without a word, locking the door behind him. Jonathan looked at the flashlight. It seemed familiar to him. He remembered using his flashlight to read that strange book under the covers in his room at his parents' house. That leather-bound book. It looked just like the one lying on the table next to him. He picked up that book with trembling fingers. He recognized it at once. He had long forgotten anything about the story, but he remembered the ink stain on the title page. This book had an ink stain too. It was the very same book from his childhood. And then he was paralyzed with fear because when he came to page 50, the 50th page, which he had hidden with paper clips so that he would not have to look at it, the paper clips were still there. He touched them again. The very same paper clips that he had placed with his trembling fingers so long ago. The very same paper clips. He turned now to the beginning of the book. He was determined to read it into the end now and discover what it was all about. He felt that it must all be set down there in print. And though in childhood he could not understand it, he was a grown-up man now, middle-aged man. He would understand it now. The title was The Midnight Express. The Midnight Express. As he read the first paragraph, it began to dawn upon him slowly, fearfully, inevitably. It was the story of a man who in childhood long ago had chanced upon a book in which there was a picture that scared him. He had grown up and forgotten about it, and one night on a lonely railroad platform, he found himself in the remembered scene of that picture. He had confronted the solitary figure under the lamp, recognized it, and fled in panic. He had taken shelter in a wayside cottage and had been led to an upper room, found the book. It was waiting for him, and he begun to read it right through to the very end at last. And this book, too, was called The Midnight Express. And it was a story of a man who in childhood, it would go on like this forever and forever. And forever there was no escape. But when the story came to the wayside cottage for the third time, a deep suspicion began to dawn upon him slowly, fearfully, inevitably, that although there was no escape, he could at least try to understand more clearly the details of the straightened circle, the fearful wheel in which he was moving. There was nothing new about the details. They had been there all the time, but he had not understood their significance. But what of the strange and dreadful being that led him up the crooked stairway? Who was that? Who was that? And what was that? The story mentioned something else that before had escaped him. The strange host who gave him shelter was about his own height. Could it be that he also was Jonathan? But why was the face of the host hidden by that dirty, wrinkled cloth? At that very moment that he asked himself that question, he heard the click of the key in the lock of the door. The strange host was entering, moving toward him, and he was casting a grotesque shadow larger than a giant on the white walls and the flickering light given off by the blaze in the fireplace. It was there, seated on the other side of the fire, facing him, but not saying a word. And then, just as a woman might prepare to remove a veil, it raised its hands to unwind the wrinkled, dirty, old cloth that was covering his face. His face. He knew who it would belong to, but Jonathan wondered, would it be dead or alive? Jonathan had no choice. He jumped forward and he grabbed that thing by the throat. But at the same time, his own throat was grabbed with the same brutal force. And the echoes of their strangled cries were like a song by the Everly Brothers. You couldn't tell one from the other. Indistinguishable. And when the last confused sounds died out together, the stillness of the room was so deep that you could have heard the ticking of the old grandfather's clock and the rush of the waves from the ocean on the distant coast, some 40 years ago. But Jonathan had escaped at last. Perhaps after all, he had caught the Midnight Express. It was a battered old book.
Yes, it was a battered old book, bound in faded old leather. It was The Midnight Express. This is a Season 3 episode of Short Story Theatre. This program was written by Alfred Noyes and performed by Bill Russo as Asa Bittridge. If you enjoy our work, like us on Facebook, subscribe, listen to our commercials, and most of all, please come back again soon. Won't you?